Like many of you, I haven't had a good 48 hours. Unlike in 2016, I accepted that Trump could win. I just didn't want him to. As a way to escape doom scrolling yesterday, I started editing my interview with today's guest, international relations scholar Jussi Hanhimäki. We actually spoke a few weeks ago, but it was strangely comforting revisiting our talk. In his book Pax Transatlantica, Jussi argues that for decades now, people have worried that the relationship between Europe and the United States is on the verge of collapse. Yet that anxiety has been what's kept it alive and relevant. He also argues that for all the isolationist rhetoric, populists are part of a transatlantic phenomenon, following in a similar trend to the third way of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, and the quote-unquote compassionate conservatism of George W. Bush, Angela Merkel, and David Cameron, and therefore, hopefully, something better in the future. I imagine everyone just wants to tune out news and analysis right now, but I hope you enjoy our talk. Jussi, thank you very much for being a guest on the show.
It's a pleasure.
I'm going to start with my Proustian questionnaire, which is, what is your favorite word?
My favorite word. I wasn't expecting this question to come up. My favorite word. You got me there. History.
What is your least favorite word?
Well, there's plenty of bad words that I don't think I should share, but but in terms of absolutely, that's a bad word. That's a bad word.
Well, I mean, my next one was going to be, do you have a favorite curse word?
Favorite curse word? Yeah, but it's in Finnish. Does that count?
Yeah.
Vittu.
Okay.
It's the F word in Finnish.
Oh, okay. Has any of your research on transatlantic relations prompted you to use it?
The research, well, not so much the research, except following current events. Yes, many times, and indiscriminately. So no particular bias.
What is the sound or noise that you love?
Sound or noise. So I like the waves. So seaside, the waves.
Nice.
That's a nice one.
Is there a sound or noise that you hate?
A motorcycle.
What is your favorite? What is your favorite book?
My favorite book is probably David Lodge's Changing Places.
Do you have a favorite book about international relations or history?
Not really. I think that's something that changes all the time. But so I would say I have many that I like, but not one in particular. Aside from my own, obviously.
Finally, is there a fictional character who you like to imagine yourself to be?
Aside from Superman, not really.
Okay. I mean, that's quite a good one.
Yeah.
It's,
well, he can fix anything, right?
So you see, at the time of we're recording, it's unclear who's going to win the US election. Mm-hmm. But there's a widespread feeling that the transatlantic alliance is on life support, and a second Trump presidency would be the death of it. Yet something I loved about your book is how, since at least the 1960s, people have been worrying that the West is on the verge of collapse. And I was wondering if you could sort of give an overview of that history.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is... I mean, I like to say the transatlantic relationship. It's the, or if even more specifically, NATO is an alliance that's been there for the last 75 years. It's often cited as being history's closest and most successful of alliances, but it's also an alliance that's constantly in the brink of dissolution and collapse. For any number of reasons. And I think that's a history that goes back, like you said, to the 1960s. And it's, of course, transatlantic relations are more than NATO. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind always. But what's been going on certainly since the 1960s is this constant questioning on the value of the alliance, that even in the context of the Cold War countries, well, in the 1960s, the crisis was focused on France and Charles de Gaulle and the France's decision to not leave NATO, but to leave the integrated military structure, which meant that NATO's headquarters, which had been in Paris from the late 40s to the mid 1960s, moved where they are now, which is in Brussels. So NATO was in an awkward situation. This was approaching the 20th anniversary of the alliance, and the original treaty had said that after 20 years, any country can give a year's notice if they want to leave. And so, as you can imagine, that is still in the NATO treaty, it's the exact same clause. So obviously, now we have 32 member states. Any one of those can give 1 year's notice and then leave NATO. So this is what many have, expected many times around. There's been a lot of crises since the 1960s and up going to the present day. It tends to be that the two most difficult alliance member states in this regard have been France, yes, and the United States on the other hand. So much of the speculation concern has tended to focus on France sort of going its own way and establishing its own policy on any number of issues, or the United States deciding that supporting Europe, providing a nuclear umbrella, keeping American troops in Europe is no longer in America's national interest. And so that's been a crisis that we've seen. Of course, Trump made it into a new rhetorical pitch during his first presidency and also in the run-up to this election coming up. So there is that constant fear. And yet, on the other hand, the alliance has been extremely successful. It has attracted new member states over the last 75 years. NATO has grown from 12 member states to 32, so it has almost tripled the number of states that have joined the alliance over the years. The biggest part of that expansion or enlargement has taken place since the end of the Cold War, so since the early 1990s. But even during the Cold War, there was some enlargement already taking place. So it's an alliance that has never lost a member, but has almost tripled the number of member states. So that tells a story that is not exactly a catastrophe. And it's an interesting story because it's sort of paradoxical, given that there is this constant tension about that focuses, aside from those two countries, but of course the American critique has always been that, or the question has been, why should the United States pay for everything and provide for everything? And so that's the idea about need to share the burden in NATO more equitably has been the big question for the United States and the big political argument, because it does travel well in American domestic politics to say, why are we paying these rich Europeans, providing them risking our lives potentially for their security and so forth. And it's a reasonable enough question. So that's something that obviously many a candidate has played upon, and Trump now has taken it to a whole new level. Last point I just add on Trump, that with all this rhetoric aside, during his presidency, NATO gained 2 new members. So that contrast was again on display about, yes, you can criticize all you like this alliance, but in the end, are you ready to give up on the long history that is behind it and the sort of the common interest that ultimately, of course, we can see.
All that kind of informs what I think is one of the main arguments in your book, which is that this constant worrying and tension and conflict is actually what gives a dynamism to the transatlantic alliance, and sort of it's how it sort of stays continually relevant by this constant sort of argument and tension and struggle.
It is. I mean, NATO is sort of to some extent constantly being renegotiated and debated and so forth. And you have to remember, it is a collection of democracies. If we all know that democracies do not thrive on unanimity of anything. When unanimity, then democracy is dead, more or less. If there is, and this is the other worry, of course, about Trump, that he's going to kill American democracy if he's elected. But I don't think we need to necessarily focus on that. That's another debate. But there is the inevitably, you have to put 32 countries together in very different sort of size and in terms of geography, in terms of population, in terms of the economy, in terms of the military force and influence they have. Those together, you can see, it's hard to see how, let's say, Finland, which is one of the new member states, and Portugal, which is one of the original member states, are likely to have identical security interests and concerns, just because where they are located. So there's bound to be a lot of differences within this, and I think that's acknowledging those differences and debating about them. And that's part of the NATO alliance, and I think it's also part of the broader transatlantic relationship. That it's constantly being renegotiated. There is no stable moment in the transatlantic relationship. In the same way, there's never a stable moment in democratic politics in any of those countries. As we see and look at the United States, you think about Great Britain, the UK, it's been quite volatile for many number of years, and there are moments in which one party or another is on top, but that moment is never going to last for very long.
Something I did enjoy in your book is you do a bit at the beginning where you sort of present various quotes about the state of sort of NATO and transatlantic relations and inviting the reader to guess when they were said. And usually it's America's breaking away from Europe, Russia, China are coming over the horizon, other countries.
Yeah.
And I thought I was doing pretty well, and I thought one was 2003, but actually it was, I think, 1976 or something like that. And I was like, damn. You sort of talk about in the book about how basically economically, militarily, diplomatically, the West, NATO, transatlantic alliance are still very powerful, and yet there's just this constant worry that everything's on the verge of collapse and there's some external foe that is going to subsume it.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, I would say it's the constant worry actually is what keeps the alliance and the overall relationship to an extent together, plus makes it's constantly responding to these concerns. I sometimes like to take the example of these debates that we've been having about American decline for some time. It comes up today. There's another moment in which, as we are talking, there's a meeting of the BRICS taking place in Russia of all places, and which is of course great concern in terms of what kind of signals are being sent with this.
There's also the main story in Britain is about how there's actually a Commonwealth leaders meeting in London right now, and a lot of Commonwealth countries have gone to the BRICS meeting as opposed to the Commonwealth meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no question. I mean, I would never say that nothing ever changes. I mean, that's absolutely not the point. But I think what, in terms of the transatlantic relation, what we see over the past, 3/4 of a century, since World War II, I would say that there has been in a strong common interest, which is based upon a number of different things. One which is the security, cooperative security alliance that was created in the late 1940s, that then turned out wasn't just a Cold War phenomenon, but something that continued and kept growing in terms of member states and so forth. So that is one aspect of it. But at the root of all that, I think there lies some other elements. One which is the political systems that we are talking about. We are talking about representative democracies. Many of the BRICS countries meeting today, for example, would not be considered by most observers, with the possible exception, I guess, of India. But even there are many differences between Indian democracy and American or British or French or whatever. So you have that kind of political systems that are sort of work in similar ways and also see often similar patterns. In a sense that, today, these days, in the last decade or so, we're talking a lot about populism. And of course, populism is a transatlantic phenomenon. It's not a phenomenon you only find in the US in the form of Trump, or in Italy in the Liga, or in Finland with the True Finns, or indeed with Nigel Farage and the whole Brexit business and so forth. But it is a transatlantic phenomenon, and that's interesting in a sense that it sort of reflects what I would say is a kind of a transatlantic political space where you see similar interests, similar concerns reflect or sort of voters react to very similar concerns and fears and promises also, which means since questions like immigration and the troubled economy and so forth rub all voters the same way often in the United States as they do in Finland, as they do in Italy, as they do in the UK. That their similar concerns are shared, and those are, I would say, a bit different concerns that are being that if you compare them to countries like India or Russia or China, or where again democracies are what they are, or political systems are what they are. But I think the concerns of many of the you might call the common people are somewhat different. And so also are, of course, the possibilities for political participation. And I think that's that whole, so because the book basically what this proposes, there's these three, the transatlantic area is kind of a space, which is on the one hand, it's a security space. NATO is the institutional embodiment of that. But it's also a political space in which you see similar political patterns, and it's populism not being the only one, but the most recent one in the headlines.
Something that really interested me about the book was how you sort of argue that populism is following a similar trend as, the third way of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, and then the sort of quote-unquote compassionate conservatism of sort of Bush and Cameron and Merkel, and how populism is just part of it's another one of those movements in that same political space.
Yes, and that, I mean, that's the sort of the core argument. Obviously it doesn't apply identically in every country of the within the transatlantic space, but I think there are similar patterns that one can detect since the end of the Cold War. And that's the other part of the argument is that during the Cold War we saw a lot of, particularly in Europe, there were strong, there was the old left and so forth. There were communist parties that were significant and so forth in countries like France, like Italy, like Finland, and a number of others. Now those suddenly disappeared in the early 1990s. But of course the concerns that those voters that identify with them did not necessarily disappear with the same moment. So that led to a kind of a realignment, which was then filled in or opening for other kinds of political arguments. And I think that's where, the idea about the new left or new Labour or new Democrats in the United States with Bill Clinton and so forth were sort of looking to attract some of those voters from the old left to come and join a bigger tent in a sense. And that, yes, that then gave way to a sort of a, there's a reaction, there's a counter-reaction, however. But in terms of the sort of moderate left and the moderate right, I mean, that's of course been part of the story across the transatlantic area since the end of the Cold War. And now populism, since what we call the Great Recession of the late 2000s, with the financial economic crisis that we had around 2007, 2009, that gave rise to, I mean, that's one of the things that really sparked the current day populism to emerge as a very strong, powerful, transnational and transatlantic political force.
The interview I put out today was with my friend Andrew Nocti, who's a journalist, and we sort of go deep into the US election. And he sort of made the point that one of the reasons why Trump has such a strong hold on the Republican Party is that for a long time, the assumption or the sort of overarching argument of the Republican Party was that rich corporate guys are best to run the country because their wealth will trickle down to you. And that was sort of the underlying argument of sort of a George W. Bush or John McCain or a Mitt Romney. And the financial crisis shook that. And sort of Trump, even though a rich guy, not the same model of sort of button down, conventional boardroom executive look that the Republican Party had been so used to.
Definitely. I mean, Trump is, of course, in his own right, is a kind of a political phenomenon that, you just have to marvel, because it's very hard to pin down what is his message. I think if there is any core message beyond Trump himself. So it's very, very difficult, but somehow he has managed to really, as you pointed out, that sort of take over this traditional, the grand old party. I mean, the Republican Party actually being the, Abraham Lincoln's, and so forth. So, and now it's become really, for the moment, this won't last because Trump won't last. But for the moment, it is Trump's party. And it's for the first time in a long time we simply see in the United States a political party really galvanize so strongly around one person. I think even, we talk, yes, there's been the Clintons, the Obamas, the Reagans and so forth, but I don't think it was ever quite in the same sort of almost fanatical kind of following. And I think that's the other thing about Trump, is that what he's done and what populism has done is that it's actually, often people fret about its impact on democracy and what have you, but in fact it has sparked more interest in the political process. People vote more today than they did 10 years ago. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? We can then, of course, debate. Is it, and some would say, yeah, but they vote the wrong way. Well, but so that's democracy, right? So it is an interesting, intellectual thing to look at. Of course, then one frets. Many of us that sort of don't necessarily enjoy the prospect of another Trump presidency.
Something that I've been thinking about for a while is, I think this is true across the transatlantic space, but in the British context, I've sort of been really interested in more so the Conservative Party than the Labour Party have sort of been struggling to figure out what they believe. And there's a sort of struggle between an imagined Thatcherite era and trying to recreate that, but also somehow being out of place with the contemporary world, the contemporary economy, so everything like that. And what your book made me think about, which I hadn't really before, of sort of the Cold War as the external overarching thing determining the politics. And then once that removed, it's created a sort of intellectual crisis across all politics. And so the various iterations of the third way, compassionate conservatism, populism, it's just this trying to figure out what these traditional parties believe because the underlying assumption has disappeared.
Mm-hmm. It's yeah. I mean, that's to me it seems quite clear that I mean what. Many would of course say that the collapse of communism, the demise of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and things like that is a good thing. I mean, many would say yes, totalitarianism in that sense was defeated or disappeared, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, what clearly happened is that the sort of ideological certainties or the ability to talk about left and right. I mean, and this is something I today wonder when people say this is left, this is right. I'm not sure. Maybe because I come from that generation in which left was communism, socialism, and so forth, and right was then, the opposite of that, the capitalism and all that. That was a fairly clear divide. Of course, it was more complex than we thought, but in the Cold War international system, because the assumption was this is a very bipolar system and so forth. That seemed to be that it was easy to read and understand the world in those simple left, right, good and bad, of course, in many ways terms. Now, after the early 1990s, when you don't have the other superpower anymore, you don't have that ideological context. It seems one side won, and then the other one threw in the towel, and then its ideas were somehow became obsolete. But and that is an ideological vacuum in a sense. So how do you go on? And things like the Washington consensus, neoliberalism. For a moment they seem very attractive, but then of course problems emerge and inequality grows and that creates other openings for other political movements from all angles, But there is clearly a kind of a vacuum, and I'm not sure if that's really been filled with different populist movements and so forth. Populism, the populists, broadly speaking, are very good at, I think, often pointing at problem, explaining this is a problem. When it comes to solving the problems, it's still a long way to go, I think, for the likes of Trump and Hungary's long-term prime minister now and so forth. So
I mean,
obviously not a coherent, not in the same way coherent kind of ideology or movement.
I mean, I often see in the British context of sort of a journalist, a commentator will say sort of how so the Labour Party is economically left but socially right, or should be economically left, socially right, or they will say the Conservatives are economically right but sort of socially liberal. But no one is yet able to figure out an overarching term to cover either of those sort of dispositions.
Yeah. No, it's very difficult. I think because it's hard to find, and I think this is what you follow. Let's say the U.S. election over the past few months, and the different issues that come out and sort of gain the headlines for a moment. They're very, very different in terms of what the purpose are. The social issues, the issues like abortion. You have abortion rights. The old campaigns used to be pretty much about higher taxes, lower taxes, and so forth, and that was enough almost to confirm people that George H.W. Bush promised no more taxes, then he raised taxes, he lost the election. But that kind of things, there's so many more buttons to push these days, and I think on top of that, you have this whole new social media landscape in which nobody follows the same news anymore, but we follow bits and pieces of here and there, and we gravitate to hearing the right news, the news we want to hear, rather than the news that may matter. So that's an added problem in this particular landscape.
Something else Pax Transatlantica made me think about is there's a really deep pathology in the American psyche, I guess going back hundreds of years, which is also shared by people across the political spectrum in the US, which is that Europe is the past and its allies are a burden to the United States. And the US just needs to keep looking west now to Asia. Just that's the future. And I think sort of George W. Bush had this view, so did Obama, as did Trump. But your book was sort of published just as Biden was coming to office. But what I've always found interesting is that unlike those administrations, he and, say, Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken have always argued that Europe is as important to American power as Asia, and that the relationship with its allies needs to be carefully cultivated. So I'm curious about what's your view on how they've done over the last 4 years?
So, let me say two things. So first of all, in terms of the United States and Europe, I mean, you're right in a sense that that the impression at least is that Europe is sort of not important. It's the smallest continent. It's, fewest number of people, stable and so forth. In the past, a big source of problems globally and so forth. But Europe had, after World War II, Europe shrunk not only because it had, destroyed itself economically and so forth in the context of the war, but then the empires were gone in the coming years. So Europe became just Europe and not the global system that was before. So that clearly minimized the role that Europeans would play on the global scene. And that sort of gave rise, the future was not in Europe, it was somewhere else. It's very debatable in terms of where we would then say whether this administration or that administration is actually pursuing a sort of drifting away from Europe, going to Asia, pivoting to Asia as Obama administration would have pointed out. And is that because Europe is truly the past, or is that simply because the transatlantic relationship is on a such strong, fundamentally strong footing that there's not really much to worry about for the United States in terms of its allies? After 75 years, even with all the tensions that there were in moments and this moment and that moment, the NATO is there. The transatlantic trade and investment patterns are extremely strong. The transatlantic area, the economic space, so there's the political space, military, but then there's the economic space, is the richest in the world. And so, and there's stability within that context. So there's not much day-to-day sort of guardianship that is necessarily needed in the context of the transatlantic relationship. It's not going to be a crisis. Europe is not going to suddenly become the point of crisis for the United States. How at the same time, many other parts of the world obviously are presenting a much bigger headache for many American administrations. In the Middle East, obviously, it's been the focus of U.S. military activities over the last 30 years. And since the first Gulf War in the early 1990s, that's where much of the military concern and strategic concern has focused upon. And China has been the rising power since the 1980s, really, but increasingly in the 21st century, China has sort of become this economic power now. And that's fine. But in terms of certainly, and I would say even in terms of Trump and the Trump administration before the Biden administration, clearly they realized that Europeans and Americans are in the same boat when it comes down to some of the biggest challenges, whether it's China, whether it's security concerns in the Middle East and so forth. China would pose a similar kind of economic concern and threat for the United States as it would for the European Union, and traditionally has. So there is a common cause. Russia presents, arguably, and this is maybe where Trump is a bit different from some of the others, but presents a security threat, international security threat for Europe, obviously, but as a consequence also for the United States. So there is a common agenda, and I think part of the reason why we think that the United States is not so interested or not so paying so much attention to Europe is simply because that bond is so ingrained already. There isn't, there's no main catastrophe that one can easily imagine to take place within that context of that relationship. The real challenge is really getting Europeans on board when it comes down to the broader policies and strategies that the United States is aiming to accomplish.
Jake Sullivan wrote an essay in 2019 about how the Trump administration was finding out that on issues like ISIS, North Korea, China, it was having to work with allies after years of sort of saying America doesn't need allies, America first, sort of everything like that.
Yeah. So, there is, of course, there is a difference that we can see. So over the last 30 years, and it's not just Trump and Biden, but the Democrats traditionally have emphasized always the sort of multilateral aspects of U.S. policy, the need to have good allies and cooperate with allies. They don't always follow those norms. I think that's kind of the other part of it, but at least they make a lot of noise about this, whereas the Republicans have traditionally been much more geared towards unilateral approaches and sort of more muscular Americanism and America first type thing, and it's no accident that Joe Biden, when he became president, he basically announced America is back. We're back in all these multilateral organizations. We are back in international diplomacy. He came and toured Europe. He met Vladimir Putin here in Geneva, but very pointedly did so only after he had met with NATO leaders and so forth to sort of to act as a kind of a spokesperson of what we still sometimes, I think, mistakenly call the West. So in that sense, there is a qualitative difference, clearly, between the two. The problem is, I think, for the United States now is that because of Trump, there is this constant uncertainty among America's allies in Europe. They wonder, okay, what's going to happen next? Okay, it's very fine and nice that Mr. Biden is so cooperative and has this team that emphasizes multilateralism, but then, every 4 years something's going to change potentially, and so what's going to happen next? So you can't really make long-term plans, and I think that's one of the fundamental issues. Then it goes back to the thing that we are talking about democracies and elections and all these other complications that are there.
I feel like with a lot of America's allies, it's sort of they wait for Mr. Hyde to resume chairmanship of the alliance and sort of just waiting for Jekyll to sort of play itself out, and then just that constant cycle.
Yeah, and I think Europeans recognize that in the end, it's not just Trump. It's not just Trump that has been saying that the Europeans have to spend more on defense and do this and that. Obama said the very same thing, and before him, other presidents have said the same thing since the 1960s. So it's an old record. And so I think I'm not sure if this moment, in a sense, is not that unique in that regard. I think what is sort of somewhat more unique is that I think in terms of since we've had Trump and these discussions were really almost on a day-to-day basis being rehearsed, I think once Russia invaded Ukraine and so forth, that gave another trigger for many European countries to indeed spend more attention on the fact that Europeans also have to share this burden and invest more in defense and be more proactive about that because of the other on the one hand, we have real security threats. On the other hand, there is a certain uncertainty about America's continued commitment. And so it's better to think ahead, in other words, to have some kind of safeguards in case something really crazy happens.
There's a new book by Samir Puri called Westlessness. His argument is that although the West mightn't be overtaken by the likes of China, its influence on international politics won't have the weight that it once did. Like there will be many power centers in the world, of which the West will be one, and it will have to adapt to being one of the rest. And I'm interested to know what your view is of that, because I feel that most of the focus of your book is sort of on the internal dynamics of the transatlantic alliance. So I'm curious about what your view is of like its external relations with the rest of the world and like its ranking among the other power centers.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, it's almost inevitable that this sort of old, this, and what I just said about the use of the term West is becoming increasingly untenable as a designation of anything, really. And I think it's, in some ways, this is long due. I think, we talked about earlier about the end of the Cold War and so forth. Well, the Cold War gave the sort of the focus, gave the form to the idea of the West. That, the United States was the leader of the West or leader of the free world. And so that is something that 30 years after the end of the Cold War is really not that significant, or is not really looked upon, either within the transatlantic space itself. People don't really, you don't hear the term, leader of the free world all that much anymore. Every now and then it comes up, and then people and I always wonder, well, who is buying this, this stuff anymore? Because it seems a bit passé, it seems a bit sort of in the past. But I think because of the way the Cold War ended, because of the sense that, yes, there would have been this ideological struggle and one side won and the other one lost, well, the winners now could remake the world in some ways in their own image. And of course, that hasn't really happened. Instead, it's created all these alternative models, both within the transatlantic space. I mean, that's why we do have populism and we do have all these different movements that would have been perhaps unrecognizable in the context of the Cold War. But then the rest of the world is not obviously content, and this is where maybe the BRICS idea, which I don't think is particularly a coherent group of countries or anything like that, but it's a sort of one part of that broader reaction to having wealth, power, influence sort of concentrated in one particular part of the world, and that it simply cannot be a long-term solution or long-term sort of lasting situation. So yeah, I think it's inevitable that there will be, and I think we've already seen this to some extent, that the United States is no longer the unequaled superpower it once was. We've seen that, yes, there's of course a lot of wealth within the transatlantic economic space, but there's also, in terms of look at economic growth around the globe, that's not where much of it is taking place most rapidly and so forth. If you look at demographics, we see that Europe is the aging continent that is starting to lose population, which makes that whole migration debate kind of counterfactual or bizarre in some ways. And so there are all these broad scale transformations that mean that it's not going to be like this forever. It's quite obvious. What is going to be like that? Then that's a case for a lot of speculation. Sadly, I'm a historian, so I tell this joke to other historians about us being very bad at predicting what's going to happen. But we are very good at predicting the past, showing how inevitable things were when they happened. That, of course, there were causes and this was the consequence. Now, what are the consequences of what's taking place today? Historians are sadly sort of ill-equipped. I think most people are, even outside of historians, are not that much better, but there we are.
We've kind of touched on this, but your book was published before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious how you view that in the context of the transatlantic alliance and the immediate future of it.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the immediate sort of unsavory reaction would have been, well, I told you so. Of course, now we have a united West and so forth. This is what the book is all about. So, but I think, and it did. I mean, the Russian invasion certainly crystallized some minds, and it caused certain changes in terms of, think of my own country, Finland, which for many decades was a neutral state, and then a year after the invasion, Finland, with massive popular support in Finland, joined NATO, and neighboring Sweden did the same the following year. So obviously there were these it sort of crystallized certain things in the minds of policymakers in a number of countries. What it has, however, sort of also raised some concerns about the future unity of this alliance, and because there are several countries within NATO, within the alliance itself, that are less than lukewarm about towing the line. Hungary being the obvious case, but then of course there's Turkey and so forth. So it's raised a lot of concerns about unity in this regard, and I think that's it may well have. I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine sort of in the long term, indirectly. I mean, now we see that it actually provoked the enlargement of NATO with 2 countries joining. But I think if you going forward, I'm hard pressed to see how Ukraine, for example, would be the next one to join NATO and so forth. I think it's raised concerns about there's a broader sense of Eurasian security, Russia's role, and so forth that really have to be addressed in one way or another in the next 5-10 years.
The FT did an interview with Jens Stoltenberg, mm-hmm. and he made the point that Ukraine could join NATO if so like he made the point that during the Cold War, West Germany always contended that East Germany was part of Germany and it was a unified mm-hmm. nation.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But the NATO's Article 5 only extended to the West German border with East Germany. And so Stoltenberg's argument was that if, depending on how things shook out in terms of a negotiated deal, NATO could say the Article 5 guarantee is drawn up at the border of the Donbass and Crimea. Mm-hmm. Under those circumstances, Ukraine could be integrated into NATO.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Theoretically, yes. Of course, that's possible. I think in practice, it's very difficult since they need, in order for that to happen, all NATO countries pretty much have to sign up for that. And at the moment, at least, I don't see that being the case, that there would be a great unanimity for that. I'm also a bit skeptical in terms of how the Ukrainians would view this. I mean, it may well come down to some kind of, in terms of Russia and Ukraine, it may well come down in the next 12 months or so to a situation of some kind of ceasefire being agreed. Sort of agreed. It's not going to be a permanent sort of solution that we can. I think to me it's sort of echoes of Korea or something like that are more likely than anything else.
I'm kind of inviting you to predict how How do you imagine things going under either a Harris presidency or a second Trump presidency?
So, if Kamala Harris wins, I think it's much easier to see what happens then, which is basically not that much will change when it comes down to certainly when it comes down to the transatlantic relationship. When it comes down to the war in Ukraine, I think there is significant pressure to do something about it, and I think whether it's Harris or Trump, both of them will do something. They will attempt to do something to move towards some kind of a temporary, perhaps diplomatic solution, ceasefire type situation. I think that's inevitable. The style would be very different. The way in which they would go about Trump would be, Trump would not necessarily consulting others on this process, whereas the Harris administration would clearly try to do some back channel diplomacy, but also keep as many allies on board as possible. Obviously, in the Harris administration, I think NATO would remain NATO without any question, and the transatlantic relationship would be important, but again, as we discussed before, it would be sort of taken for granted, which is the sort of the natural American approach, I think, to relations with Europe, is that Europe can be taken for granted because the dependency still runs mostly one way, especially when it comes down to questions of security. And I think Trump, I doubt he would leave NATO or do something along those lines. He might leave some other multilateral organizations or leave in things like the climate agreement and so forth. So that sort of things probably yes. But in terms of NATO, he probably use the leverage he has to continue from the transactional kind of point of view that he's always had on these things and say, you got to pay more. And then maybe we'll keep protecting you. I mean, this is a businessman approach to these kinds of things. And of course, the fact that we all think, which may not be true at all, that he has some kind of a special relationship with Vladimir Putin would be his bargaining chip vis-a-vis Europe.
Jussi, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I hope we can do this again, and with it's a very nice discussion, and appreciate the time.
If it was at all possible to enjoy today's talk, please like, rate, comment on whichever platform you're listening on. If you'd like to buy Jussi's book, Pax Transatlantica, visit the Strategy Aaron bookshop page linked in the show notes. And if you're still coming to terms with Tuesday, please do what you can to look after yourself. Hope you tune in again next time.